Greetings, folks. Welcome. If you've watched all of my other videos about state and U.S. metropolitan area economic development, then you've seen a lot, and hopefully you've learned a lot too. We've looked at the effects of well over 100 regional characteristics on the economic development of regions. Everything from taxes and human capital, to industry clusters and occupations, to climate and crime. And we've seen some pretty interesting results about the factors that influence the growth of good jobs. Although it's hard to reduce hundreds of results to just a few, we can focus on a handful of earlier findings to see what types of themes emerge. Here's a figure that shows the effects of 7 regional characteristics on the economic development of states and U.S. metropolitan areas. As always, the Economic Development Index used in the analysis is a combination of an employment index, income index, and employment persistence index, so it captures the growth of good jobs in U.S. regions. And the variables used to build the indices use data from 1990 to the mid-2010s. This covers about one generation of workers. I picked the 7 variables to give you a big picture of the types of regional characteristics that we looked at in other videos. The variables are low cost of doing business, specialization in primary metal product manufacturing, share of the workforce in creative occupations, the presence of large businesses, after making adjustments for the types of industries in the region, businesses in high-tech sectors, a measure of the amenities present in the region, and the percentage of new homes built between 1985 and 1990. And this new housing variable is measured as of 1990, so it captures new residential construction at that time. The height of the bars in the figure represents the size of the impact on overall economic development in terms of standard deviations when we increase the regional characteristic of interest by 1 standard deviation. And the bars are shaded to indicate impacts that are statistically significant. As an example of how to interpret the bar heights, the bar for metros and high-tech businesses tells us that a 1 standard deviation increase in the U.S. metropolitan area's percentage of businesses in high-tech sectors corresponds with about a 0.3 standard deviation increase in the Economic Development Index. In other words, high-tech businesses help the growth of good jobs in U.S. metropolitan areas. The big take-home message from this figure is that the creative economy and high-tech industries are particularly important to the economic development of U.S. metropolitan areas, whereas regions that specialize in manufacturing back in 1990 and regions with an abundance of large companies also back in 1990 did not perform as well over the next 25 or so years. Also, when looking at the figure, we see some differences in the factors that impact the economic development of states versus metropolitan areas. For example, low cost of doing business, high-tech companies, and even residential construction contribute to economic development when studying metros, but not when comparing the performance of states. Now, let's look at the effects of the same 7 regional characteristics on U.S. metropolitan areas, but we'll make a distinction between the employment index that measures growth and the income index that measures the productivity of regions. Here, we see that low cost of doing business, amenities, and lots of new residential construction are associated with higher levels of employment growth, but these characteristics of regions do not increase productivity. The creative economy and high-tech businesses, however, positively impact the growth and productivity of U.S. metropolitan areas. These results suggest that human capital, in other words, the creative economy, and high-tech businesses are contributing to the divergence of U.S. metropolitan areas. Recall that divergence is a process by which regions that start ahead of other places actually grow and develop faster than the rest, so they move even farther ahead. This is different than a process of convergence in which places that start behind catch up to others. With all this in mind, let's go back to the beginning of this video when I mentioned that we've looked at over 100 regional characteristics to figure out the keys to the growth of good jobs. In the last couple of figures, we focused on 7 of them. And as it turns out, many regions can be described by combinations of characteristics. That's because a lot of the regional characteristics are highly correlated. For example, places with high percentages of college-educated workers also tend to have higher percentages of workers in creative occupations and higher percentages of businesses in high technology. To account for the fact that regions can be described by combinations of characteristics, for example, some places have high percentages of workers in creative occupations and lots of high-tech businesses, I used a method called cluster analysis to assemble groups of metros that are similar in terms of their regional characteristics. Specifically, I used the 7 characteristics of the cost of doing business, primary metal manufacturing, creative economy, large businesses, high-tech businesses, amenities, and residential construction to take the 381 metropolitan areas and put them into 10 groups, which are called clusters. And I should point out that the use of 10 clusters is somewhat arbitrary. I could have used more than 10 or less than 10. For this analysis, I picked 10 because it's a manageable number of groups, but there are enough groups so the regions in the clusters are somewhat different in terms of their characteristics. I promise that I won't walk through all 10 of the clusters. It would be boring if I did, but looking at a few of them will give us a good idea about differences in the economic development of regions. One of the clusters that we joined together, and this is something that we anticipated, has metropolitan areas with large shares of creative economy workers and high-tech businesses. Some of the regions included in this cluster include Boston, Raleigh, North Carolina, and San Jose. But along with having lots of creative workers and high-tech businesses, metropolitan areas in this cluster have relatively high cost of doing business. That is, this cluster ranks 3rd out of the 10 clusters for the highest cost of doing business. So how do the regions in this cluster described by creative workers, high-tech businesses, but relatively high costs perform in terms of economic development? Well, this cluster had a clean sweep for the best performance according to the employment, income, persistence, and overall economic development indices. That is, this cluster did the best for all 4 of their economic development indicators. I think it's safe to say that metropolitan areas in this cluster are diverging away from other U.S. regions. Now, let's look at a second cluster of similar metropolitan areas. There is a group of metros with the lowest cost of doing business. It's the 3rd highest out of the 10 clusters for new residential housing, and it's above average for amenities. Some of the places in this cluster include Asheville, North Carolina, Las Vegas, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've actually spent some time in all 3 of these places, and they're all, in their own way, pretty cool. But what about their performance for economic development? Well, these metropolitan areas with the lowest cost of doing business have the 5th best out of 10 clusters employment index, but they're the 2nd lowest for the income index. So we can say that having low cost of doing business contributes to moderate growth, but certainly not a growth of good jobs. Here's another example of a cluster of similar metropolitan areas. The regions in this group are characterized by the highest percentage of new residential housing and the 2nd highest score for amenities. So these are great places to live, as evidenced by the high amenity scores, and lots of homes were built in these places between 1985 and 1990. You might be wondering why I measure new housing as the dwellings built between 1985 and 1990, but it's because the economic development indicators track regions between 1990 and the mid-2000 teens. So the idea is to see how conditions back in 1990 affected things moving forward. At any rate, some of the metros in this cluster include Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Prescott, Arizona, and St. George, Utah. In terms of performance for economic development between 1990 and the mid-2000 teens, this cluster, characterized by lots of new residential housing and high amenities, had the 3rd highest employment index, but it ranked last out of 10 clusters for the income index. So these metropolitan areas certainly grew, but they did not experience a growth of good jobs. Here's a final example of one of the clusters of similar metropolitan areas. This one has the 3rd highest specialization in primary metal manufacturing, so the metropolitan areas are relatively strong for manufacturing, but it has the lowest values for amenities, new residential housing, and high-tech companies. Some of the metros included in this cluster are Flint, Michigan, Kokomo, Indiana, and Springfield, Ohio. In terms of performance, this cluster was ranked last for the employment index. Since I had so much fun looking at the clusters of U.S. metropolitan areas, I did the same thing for states. In other words, I used the same 7 characteristics of regions, for example, things like low cost of doing business, the creative economy, and amenities, to join states into clusters. The only difference is that whereas I worked with 10 clusters of metropolitan areas, I'm working with 5 clusters of states. But as I mentioned before, the exact number of clusters to analyze is somewhat arbitrary. Although I'm working with 5 clusters of states, I could have instead chosen 4 or 6 or 7 or really any number. As an example of the states that are similar in terms of their regional characteristics, one of the clusters has the highest specialization in primary metal manufacturing, so these states are well known for manufacturing, but it rates low for amenities and new residential construction. Some of the states included in this cluster are Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. In terms of how these places fared for economic development between 1990 and the mid-2010s, they had the lowest values for the employment index, employment persistence index, and overall economic development index. Here's another example of a cluster of similar states. This one, which includes Alabama, Georgia, and Nevada, had the second highest rate of new residential construction and the lowest share of creative workers. This group of states was the lowest ranked of the 5 clusters by the income index, which shows, and this is similar to what we found for the metropolitan area clusters, that new residential construction does not translate into high productivity and incomes. For the next cluster of states with similar regional characteristics, a group that includes Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York has the largest share of creative workers and high-tech businesses. This cluster is the top performing one for the income index, which is a measure of productivity, but it's in the middle of the pack for the other economic development indices. This general result is a little different than what we found in the analysis of the metropolitan area clusters. When focusing on metropolitan areas, the top cluster for human capital and technology, and again, this included regions such as Boston, Raleigh, and San Jose, had the best performance by all measures of economic development. So if the group of states with the largest shares of creative workers and high-tech businesses is not the top performing cluster for economic development, what cluster is? Well, as it turns out, when focusing on states, the top cluster for economic development is characterized by the lowest cost of doing business and the lowest percentage of large businesses, but also the lowest share of high-tech companies and the least amount of new residential construction. Some of the states in this top-performing cluster for economic development include the Dakotas, both north and south, Wyoming, and Montana. I could go on and on talking about clusters of regions. In fact, it's one of my favorite topics. But I'm afraid it's time to wrap up this video with a few key takeaways. First off, we learned, and this is a theme that has come up in other videos, that human capital and high technology are contributing to a divergence of U.S. metropolitan areas. A second finding from this video is that some of the strongest performers for employment growth, and this includes clusters of metropolitan areas with high amenities and lots of new residential housing, are not among the leaders for the income index and the overall economic development index. In other words, growth does not always translate into economic development. A third and final key takeaway from this video is the most important regional characteristics for economic development differ between metropolitan areas and states. And if you think about the mechanisms by which human capital and technology affect economic development, this makes perfect sense. Human capital and technology make people more productive, but they also have spillover effects, or externalities, to use a fancy word, that increase the productivity of people around them. And although these spillover effects are powerful, they sort of peter out as people are farther apart. So these externalities explain the productivity advantage of cities with high levels of human capital and technology, but they are less important when looking at states that cover a lot more area.